Deep Space Nine is the Star Trek with the greatest focus on political concepts like colonialism, feminism, queerness, and post-scarcity economics. Join hosts and guests who aren't just Trekkies, but activists, academics, artists, therapists, even elected officials, as we take a deep dive into the text and subtext where few Star Trek podcasts have gone before.
Welcome to Deep Space Dive. We discuss Deep Space Nine's themes and characters with a different topic on each episode. Unlike many other quality Deep Space Nine podcasts, we are not an episode-by-episode recap. As a result, every episode of our podcast is full of spoilers. If you're just watching Deep Space Nine for the first time, we recommend that you finish your binge and then go back and listen to our archives. They'll be here waiting for you. I'm Sarah Daniel Rasher. When I'm not getting paid to use math to save the world, I write about film and figure skating. I was the founding captain of my high school Star Trek club, and I once got Nicole DeBoer to kiss me at a convention.
I am Elana 11. And I'm jealous. I'm also the host of Graphic Policy Radio, where comics and politics meet. I've worked at the intersection of comics, nerd culture, and social change for over a decade. And my biggest Trek cred is I got to give a speech on fan activism at a rally organized by Lita, aka Chase Masterson. I've also been active in New York politics since, I want to say 2004, which is how I got to know this week's guest. Senator Gustavo Rivera has represented the 33rd Senate District in the Bronx since November of 2010. Since taking office, Senator Rivera has fought health inequality, serving as the chair of the New York State Senate's Health Committee. I know him as a champion for single-payer health care, bail reform, and sentencing reform. Gustavo was born in Santurce, Puerto Rico. In 1998, Gustavo graduated from the University of Puerto Rico and moved to New York to begin a doctoral program in political science. He's been here ever since. He also has taught as an adjunct professor at Pace University and Hunter College. When Gustavo ran in 2010, it was extremely rare for an insurgent candidate to run against the corrupt Democratic establishment and win, but he did it. And it showed everyone what was possible in New York. It was a really big deal for us, which is to say, he is both an elected official and an experienced campaigner. And as I recently learned on Twitter, he is a huge Trekkie. Welcome to the show, Gustavo.
I am extremely excited to be here. I'll tell you that I just was involved in an unnecessary primary. And one of the things that made me angry about that primary is I could not do this podcast earlier. So I just want to say that for the record.
Oh, thank you. I was thinking the same thing. We had spoken before it became evident that the real estate industry was going to put, and charter schools were going to put was it like millions of dollars in a race against you?
It was about maybe like 1.4 million around there, give or take.
Yeah. So, before we knew they were going to be spending $1.4 million trying to get a school privatization person elected in your place, we had planned on having you come on. And then when I was like, oh, fuck, we've got an actual race, we just sort of was like, okay, well, we'll deal with this after the election. And no joke, the night of the election, when we saw you win the primary, I tweeted like, also, Gustavo can come on my podcast now.
And so, I believe I responded saying, let's schedule it immediately.
Yes, exactly. We did. So I was like, I hope I don't sound self-interested in writing that, but you made me feel validated in that sentiment. So good to hear it. You know, I've known you've been a nerd forever because you're obviously a nerd, but I did not know you were a Star Trek nerd in particular. So tell me, how did you first get into Star Trek as a fan?
Well, first of all, I will take that as a compliment. Yes, I am indeed a nerd, proudly so. So I started with Star Trek with the movies, actually, and it's because I was born in 1975, right? So I was obviously not around for the original series, and although it was in reruns in the 1980s, it was probably the Wrath of Khan and then the Search for Spock that I actually started when I really started becoming like a big Trek fan, and because those were available then on VHS tapes. That was one, particularly the Voyage Home, the one with the friggin' whales. That was the one that I watched because we recorded it off of, because when I was a kid, we used to record movies off of HBO. We'd record it on a tape, right? And then we could watch it again. So I watched the Voyage, Star Trek 4, The Voyage Home, like dozens and dozens and dozens of times when I was a kid. So by the time that the Next Generation came around, and then Deep Space Nine and even Voyager, like I would watch it like religiously on a weekly basis.
So did you start watching DS9 as soon as it was airing, basically?
DS9, yes, because I picked up the Next Generation like a couple of seasons in, and I was always enamored with it. But it was actually Deep Space Nine that became my absolute total favorite. And for me, it was, and it took me a while to figure this out, but it was the first show in which it was no longer about exploration. It wasn't about like, let's go see what we can go, it's not about, since they weren't moving all the time, they weren't traveling somewhere. Instead, they just got to deal with so many issues, whether it's, PTSD, sexuality, religion, and certainly politics. So I was just completely fascinated by it. And I was like, and I'm very thankful that you made me rewatch it. I rewatched the entire show a couple of years ago. I think it was one of my pandemic watches. And then,
same.
There you go. But that was 2 years ago. So then for this podcast today, I watched like in the last 3 or 4 days, I watched like 7 or 8 episodes all the way from the first season all the way up to the 6th season. So I got to like be reminded of so much, and I'm sure that we'll talk about it, but I absolutely loved the show. And I watched Deep Space Nine. I watched all the way through basically religiously when it would air.
Yeah, we were delighted when we sent a list of episodes that was sort of like, here's some ones we were thinking about. You don't have to watch all of these. And you were like, no, I'm watching them all. And we were like, yes, yes, that is awesome. We love that.
I did. I watched all of them.
Definitely.
And I was reminded of, oh my goodness, I was reminded of so much. I mean, I want to take it one step at a time. So I will leave my comments. I have a couple of general comments though. I am reminded of how silly the fights were. The fight choreographies were so silly that the double punch, when they like grab their hands like in a triangle and then like hit somebody in the face. You know the one I'm talking about?
Yeah.
That was.
Oh, you mean the hand-to-hand combat? Okay.
Yes. The fight choreographies are just ridiculously slow. Like it was one of those things where I was reminded. It was so quaint to watch like such a silly fight like choreographies. That was very bad, but I appreciated it. It was like old school in that regard. That right now they would bring in like all sorts of consultants and make it like a jiu-jitsu fight or some other stuff like that. So that was cool. And also that I watched so many from like different seasons. It made me like, it certainly told me, because when I tell people about Deep Space Nine, I said it's absolutely the best Trek series, but you got to put up with the fact that it was so slow at the beginning, and the fact that you had 23 episodes per season, because that was just the way that it was done, and also the fact that they were so stuck on this formula, at least early on, of doing, they always had to be a B story. So there was so all of these conventions. One of the great things about seeing so many episodes from different seasons in the last couple of days was that I got to be reminded of how they just figured out kind of to be their own show by the time that they got to the 4th or the 5th season. And certainly by the time the Dominion War happened, like they were absolutely firing on all thrusters. So I was very thankful for you to remind me of that. So yes.
Oh, yay.
Yeah. One of the things that we talk about a lot here is that it does have this sort of mixture of like quaintness and things that feel like you can really see the 25 years old growing on it, and things that like it could have been filmed last week. So
absolutely,
it's fun to hear you reflecting on that as well.
And the performances there's some of these folks are so good. Avery Brooks is freaking like hitting it out the park. I believe that you asked me to watch one of the episodes in which the first time that you see the longing in Odo's face for Kira, which she says that she loves, what's his face?
Vedic Bareil. Yeah, you're right.
I love him. And it was the first time that you saw him go like, and he kind of changes the subject, but the longing is there. And you're like, damn it, Rene Auberjonois was freaking great. And I remembered how, and pardon me for a second here while I go back to my teenage self, but Nana Visitor certainly, like, oh
Yeah.
my goodness, she brought all yeah, Kieran Reeves
You're in good
is
company. It's
woo, so my God, she's
you're in good
amazing.
company here. Do not fear. As you know, for sure. It was funny watching that episode to be like, oh, this is when the show needed you to absolutely know that Odo did indeed have those feelings and that he did
Mhm.
indeed not want Kira to be aware of them in that moment. Yeah. Yeah. One of the questions that we always think about is, do you feel like DS9 or Star Trek in general influenced your politics or your activism growing up?
I think that I got to be honest with you, not so much, only because I was also, since I'm an all around nerd, I might as well just completely, like, be completely open and honest about this. I was also an RPG nerd, and I played like Dungeons and
No.
Dragons, Vampire the Masquerade,
Mhm.
Mage the Ascension, like all those
Yeah.
things. And I loved Trek for its more utopian vision, and I kind of took more of what politics, like as far as politics, for more from my RPG stuff, particularly Vampire the Masquerade, because it was all about, people being backstabbers and like intrigue and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And so I kind of I kind of sort of assumed that that's what politics was going to be like. I had no idea that I was going to, be in this world as a, as a main player in it, right? But when I thought about utopias and societies in utopia, we're thinking about the things that we're trying to get to, or things that we're trying to achieve. Certainly, Trek was absolutely on my mind. But again, as I've revisited, what was great about DS9, I believe, is that it just started. It was much more gray than Next Generation, and certainly than the original series. There was like so much more humanity in it that I so appreciate. Like, as much as I love Picard, as much as I love, everyone in that show, DS9 just seemed more human to me. But as far as my politics are concerned, I got to say that I probably borrowed more from the intrigue in my RPG playing, as opposed to from watching Trek.
So are you basically feeling like the Senate Republicans would be the Ventru in the Camarilla?
Look at you showing off your knowledge. I will have you know that, yes, I'm by the way, to go just a little deeper into that rabbit hole, but not all the way in. My favorite clan is the Nosferatu, and I am absolutely, like, I have a high level Nosferatu. That was my absolute favorite clan. I loathed the Ventru and the Toreador even more. So I can't.
Really? Wow.
Oh, yes.
You are counterintuitive to every other player I've ever worked with. And someday we'll have to play a game together, because
oh my God,
no one has ever said either of those things to me. So,
oh my God, yes. I am so, I will, that should be another podcast, but certainly my
okay,
RPG
we're going to do another podcast.
Stuff. We'll do another podcast of that.
Sarah's leading another RPG that we're doing together as well. So they're totally down with that. I'll get back to you there.
Yeah. We're currently playing something called Thirsty Sword Lesbians.
Mm-hmm. In space, of course.
Thirsty. I'm sorry. The name of the game is Thirsty
Sword Lesbians. Yes.
Sword.
And
Not one that I'm familiar with, but God bless y'all.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's a really good game, actually. It's a very different space of the future than the one we have from DS9.
Before we spend the entire time talking about RPGs, even though we definitely could.
Oh yeah.
We were sort of thinking about, you mentioned that Deep Space Nine has sort of a shift towards feeling more human than other series.
Yes.
And one of the things we were also thinking about is that Deep Space Nine has sort of a political shift, where the earlier series and earlier movies really clearly positioned democratic socialism as the political system of the future and like the end result of social and technological process. Mm-hmm. But in Deep Space Nine, we see a lot of governments that are just not democratic, and some of them are fairly functional. Well, like we see like the Klingons, who I actually had to like remind both of us that's not a democratic system at all. Like, and then we see like the Cardassians, we see the Ferengi, and we see the Dominion. And then when we do see democratic societies like Bajor and the Federation, they have serious problems with corruption, with inequality, with just sort of factionalism. So we were wondering if you had insight into what Deep Space Nine is saying about the future of political systems and the possibility of having political utopias.
I think that so if we talk, for example, about The Collaborator, you asked me to watch that one. And I, by the way, I had forgotten how much I love Kira Nerys and how much I hate Kai Wynn. Oh my God, I hate that woman. Such a duplicitous, slimy bastard. And but that episode, and I believe that there's another one a little bit later on that you have folks asked me to watch, are about the struggles of democratization, like societies that are post-colonial societies trying to establish democracies. In, like, for example, we can certainly think about some of post-Soviet republics, or we can think about South Africa, for example. The idea that there was certainly in the case of Bajor, you had an occupying force that left. In the case of South Africa, you had not an occupying force per se, but a racist minority that ruled the country until the racial majority took over. But the struggles of how to actually establish a democratic system definitely show there, and the this is why I'm saying it's certainly much more human. I'm not sure that a utopia is possible. Like, I think, one of the things that I say to people all the time, that I used to say to people all the time about New York City, is that I kind of believe that this is the closest that we're going to get to a utopian society. And the reason I say that is because I have not seen a place that is just so diverse as far as demographics, as far as ages, as far as religions, as far as languages. And for the most part, certainly there's clashes. Certainly there's like, we brush up against each other, and sometimes we punch a little bit. But for the most part, we get along. And for the most part, we appreciate each other. And for the most part, we value each other. That's different. So this is probably the closest that we're going to get. And so the idea that you would see Bajor struggling with establishing a democratic society, and then having to deal with the fact that one of the most important parts of its culture is its faith, and the fact that the religious leaders, certainly Kai Wynn being the main one, have deep political and power interests, right? So it's not just about Opaka, for example, right, who we see in flashbacks. Certainly she made, there's that very tough choice that she made, that's actually talked about in The Collaborator, of revealing for the sake of safety of millions of people, revealing where a couple of thousand lived, etc., and that these folks were exterminated. But she is viewed as somebody who was deeply faithful, and that ultimately used her faith as a way to talk about how to make the life of all Bajorans better, and that she was very, selfless in that regard, and that she always thought about Bajorans first and then about her second. And Kai Wynn is completely different from that. So the struggles that you have when this is at the center of what your culture is. The faith is at the center of the culture, and then you have somebody who is respected because of her position as a leader of faith, but certainly a power-hungry douche. Like, it just shows the how difficult democracies are to both establish and to maintain.
Yeah.
I find it really interesting that you're sort of drawing attention to New York City as a place that's really trying to push toward that vision of utopianism. And I actually see my home state of Illinois having some of the same experiences, where it's like we've got a more progressive governor than anybody really thought he was when we elected him. And a supermajority in our legislative bodies, and for better or for worse, whatever you think about Lori Lightfoot, a Democratic mayor of Chicago, and seeing both the things that get accomplished that are tremendous and the things that just can't happen, and where things get bottlenecked. And the idea that you can have optimal conditions in a lot of ways politically, and then it sort of opens up the new issues that can arise.
Certainly.
Well, I mean, the thing with New York, right, is like, sorry, I was going to say, we have this trade-off where for most of my life, you'd be like, oh, the Senate's the problem, the state Senate's the problem, because the Republicans had control of the state Senate or functional control of the state Senate for, longer than my lifespan. Then now that the Democrats have control of the state Senate, we're like, oh, fuck, it's the assembly. Carl Heastie's the Democratic runs the assembly is like preventing progressive policies from coming through. And now the assembly is the problem. We have to get better. The different houses each of the state government will pivot between being the problem in order to prevent progressive policies from passing. And so I don't view it as being an impossibility, more like as being aware that the power is never stable and that the interests of capital are always there to have to be fought. I wasn't surprised suddenly we had to deal with Carl Heastie. Yeah.
As a parenthesis, you should have Carl on. I believe that he is an enormous fan of the original series, for the record. But
really?
yes, seriously.
Interesting. I can hold that over him.
This is a DS9 podcast, but I'm just saying, like, he might be a fan of the original. He's a big fan of the original series, as I understand it.
Okay.
But one thing I was going to say is that
funny.
That again, the idea is that it's not called a struggle for nothing, right? It's there. I just have a sense that we have to constantly try to, as we say, we have the ideals of the country. When the United States of America was founded, the ideals that it was founded on were these ideals, right? These concepts that were kind of these heightened things that we're trying to achieve, while it was done by white landowning males that excluded basically anybody but themselves from actually having political power. And we've worked. The struggle has been about expanding that, and certainly it is not. It doesn't move in that direction. Always, it can retrench, right? So we have to constantly struggle and fight to actually make it a better, more inclusive, better democratic society, and try to get closer to those ideals. But that's what I'm saying. That this is that I believe that what this that what is this. For example, there's the other episode that one of the episodes that you suggested, Shakar, which had this is the whole reclamator one, right? So the idea that Kai Wynn was just like, I am going to, as a small and petty person, and just wanted to have order and wanted to establish this authority. So she would go to a war over reclamators, over some without having without giving it an opportunity to actually, negotiate and try to get a better. It was all about how is she going to establish authority. That shows kind of the back and forth, the struggle that we constantly have to go through. Because we've created institutions, and then we'll have small petty people actually occupy those institutions, and we have to make the institutions better because we have to save ourselves from small petty people, which will come because humanity is like that.
What I find so fascinating about that episode, and also about any of the other episodes that have to do with Bajor and economic development, is like, on the one level, you're looking at Kai Wynn explaining how they need these soil reclamators because they have to be used around the country, around the planet equitably. And you're like, yeah, that is true. Like, you can't just say this one area that happened to have access to them first should have a monopoly on them. We need to have, and I see what we might need to look at what global planning looks like when it comes to resource development for the country. But then as it plays out, you're like, oh, but she's also just doing this, like you said, to wield petty control, and is deciding she's trying to dictate a national agricultural plan, a la Mao or Stalin, and using it as an excuse to steamroller people. So it's sort of like, it sounds like it's, but I don't want people to take from that the feeling like, well, obviously anytime somebody says you can't have what you want whenever you want it, it's because they're a douchebag,
No.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so many instances. It's one of the ways that Deep Space Nine is embedded in my brain, where I'll hear about some sort of political conversation getting bottlenecked over a resource or something that has, competing regional needs. And I'll be like, okay, they're fighting over reclamators. Like it's such it's such a powerful analogy for like they just really hit on both like the perfect technobabble for it and like just the perfect sort of narrative analogy for the way that it can be both a petty squabble and something that really does have meaning for equity and meaning for people's lives.
Because at the center of it, it was the idea was she was doing it as the reasoning for it, and this is why it's like there was no, Kai Wynn did not allow for this to be decided by any type of diplomacy, because ultimately it was a power move for her. But the goal of making sure that the reclamators would be in a part of the planet that would actually produce products for export to bring wealth to the planet and to put them in a better situation, as they said, to actually join the Federation ultimately. Like I can see how it would be, how that would remind you of it, because those are certainly both legitimate things. If it wasn't a small petty person in the middle of it, then there might have been some negotiation possible. And Kira tried, Homegirl tried, but she got tested, and then she went back to her old ways and that weird, silly fighting that they did, which is still so funny to me. These stunted fights are so ridiculous.
Yeah, and it was hard because they were hoarding those resources unfairly, but at the same time, it's like the way it's like Wynn made it so that it was hard to actually achieve equity because she was kind of doing the right thing for the wrong reasons.
Well, from the season 1 episode where you have the older farmers trying to maintain subsistence agriculture while Bajor is like time to do global export of our agricultural products. My brain is just like, I don't know, guys, this sounds like an IMF kind of situation. Maybe you want to do some more diversity of your agricultural systems, and maybe you don't want to pivot to export. I don't know. It felt very 90s to me, actually, for the assumption to be that, of course, they should be moving away from subsistence and towards, and it was the 90s, and towards like global exports, and then we look at like the outcomes of having monocrops and being in Puerto Rico, and it's like, we should be able to grow most things here, and yet, they're going to be limited to only certain kinds of export crops. And like, what does that leave an island, or what's that leave people with when they're trying to just be extractive and make them be dependent on international trade? I have feelings.
I understand. And I'm sad because that's the only one that I didn't get to. That season 1, episode 15.
Okay.
I did not get to. No. Don't apologize for that, because but I am gonna still watch it, because it absolutely reminds me of like what you're describing. I vaguely remember this episode, but it definitely reminds me of this notion that you're going to have entire tracts of land that are made not to feed people, instead just to have it as a product. And then you have, like, whether it was cane or pineapples or coffee, and you did not have, as opposed to having the ability to have the farmer choose what it is that they're going to plant, so that they can actually feed themselves and their family, and maybe have provide locally, and have that be kind of the discussion again of how we actually achieve a better situation for everybody. Because yes, having a larger, an ability to sell things, to provide more economic activity and more economic opportunity, but what does that do to folks who can barely feed themselves because they can't grow in their own land something that they can actually eat?
Yeah.
I have a question for you, Gustavo. If you were in the Bajoran government, do you feel like they should join the Federation or maintain their independence?
Okay, well, that one, I would say, no, I would say, because the Federation is like the United Nations. It is not, at least the way I see it, it is like the United Nations, in which certainly there are allyships that are formed, but it's not one, like, they still maintain some level of autonomy. not necessarily independence, but certainly autonomy. And I would say in that situation that at least I would say that I would be, see, I'm still thinking about it as you asked me. I would say we should join it. I would say we should join the Federation because of the nature of the relationship as I understand it, right? As far as, and I don't know what the new series have done to how the Federation is structured, but certainly in this series, as I understand it, certainly in Next Gen and DS9, and I guess Voyager, the notion of the Federation as a federation of planets, each one having its level of autonomy, but then sharing intelligence, sharing culture, sharing science, sharing resources, and being, and kind of belonging to this, to this group of folks that each individual planet maintains a level of autonomy, as opposed to, say, a state in a, because I know that we were talking about this before, the idea of, whether there's any parallels between the situation in Puerto Rico and, whether Puerto Rico should become the 51st state of the United States or not. And I would say that in this case, the situation is very different, because it would be, in a sense, it would be the parallel would not be the Federation. The parallel would be returning to some sort of relationship with the Cardassians. I believe that would be a much more apt comparison, because in the case of the Federation, they're coming in and they're saying, we're going to be helping you out. We're going to provide some level of stability, some military assistance if necessary, et cetera. And we're going to provide you with technology so that you can get back on your feet, all these sort of things. Like, for example, I mean, think about the fact that if they were a member of the Federation, they wouldn't have had the issue about the damn reclamators, because they would have been able to reach out to the Federation and say, like, we only have reclamators for half the planet, but can you help us out to produce more so that we can have them all over? And I am certain that would have been resolved, right? As opposed to, if we go as far, the reason why it's not a parallel to the situation in Puerto Rico is because, although I'm sure that many folks will disagree, I believe that the relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico has not been a productive one for Puerto Ricans. And ultimately, we are a colony of the United States, and we have not had a level of autonomy or independence that has allowed us to determine our own future. And it has been the extraction of Puerto Rican resources. When it was in the 18th and 19th century, it might have been farms, but in the 21st century, we're just talking about a place where you can dump a lot of products that can be purchased, and not necessarily something that is beneficial to the people who actually live in Puerto Rico. So I don't believe that there's a parallel between the Federation. It would be a parallel between, like, going back to the Cardassians and saying, like, well, take us back in some way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction to make, that I think resolves a lot of the problematic parallels that people try to make between the Federation and powerful countries like the United States. Whereas I was thinking, like, the Federation is very analogous to NATO in a lot of ways, and like conversations we're having about countries joining NATO, where there's not a question of whether they're going to maintain their autonomy. But at the same time, there's countries that really held out of that relationship for a long time for exactly the fear of that autonomy.
This is, again, why I think that DS9 is a superior series, because certainly the Next Generation had this basically this very positive view of the Federation, which I still would say is, again, we're talking about utopias, we're talking about a fictional story, etc. But the introduction of that part, of that secretive part of the government, if you will, of the Federation, the fact that there was this secret entity that started wars and did also, basically it was that Section 30 whatever
31, but it's fine.
Absolutely, it was a parallel to the CIA, but it was as a way for them to say, we want to make this more gray. We want to experiment here with what the format has been of Trek, and we want to say that it's a little bit muddier than it might have seemed. It's not as pretty as it might have seemed before. And so that I was just reminded of that there was that section 30 whatever.
Yeah, I will never remember numbers, so I just should defer to Sarah every time.
31. It's definitely 31.
I wanted to dive into the Pale Moonlight just because it's an episode that we haven't covered a lot on the podcast, and it's such a classic example of a lot of the ethical challenges we've been talking about, where the idea of what might be right seems at odds with maintaining democratic or progressive or just sort of like values of openness. I'm just really excited to hear your thoughts, Gustavo, on that episode and how it fits into the conversation we're having.
Okay, another thing that we hadn't talked about yet is that you also gave me a lot of episodes with Garrick in it.
Andrew Robinson.
Oh my God,
yeah.
he's so good. I don't know if is he still with us?
Yes.
Okay.
He is not only still with us, he is now doing YouTube plays of Garrick and Bashir fan fiction with Alexander Siddig and occasionally Armin Shimmerman. They all get to, and Cyril Lofton, I think, has done some too. They all get together on the internet and return to play their characters.
So good. He's so good. Okay, so that's the first thing. Yeah. Garrick is a delight. This one, again, Avery Brooks should do this as a one-man show. Like him talking directly to camera when he is just, confessing his sins to someone that will never hear it, right? He should do that as a one-man show. But this one was fantastic.
Yeah.
Certainly for the performances, but also because, as you say, it really deals with the fact that there are tough choices that have to be made which is the reality, right? This is the toughest of choices, right? The idea that as in the middle of a war, when you know that there are more and more of your countrymen, in this case, allies of the Federation, not just humans, but every one of them, dying every single day, and that you have an opportunity to actually fundamentally change the shape of that conflict. Those are things that we really have to deal with, right? So it's not something that me as a state legislator, I don't have to deal with things that are so heavy, but certainly there are the question about what would you do in a situation in which you know that your actions can have a net positive impact, but still you have to violate, in this case, like some of his, the fact that he knows that he was an accessory to murder a few times. Right. And Garrick is one that did it because Garrick tells him at one point, he's like, I know why you came to me, bro. Like, you ain't going to do this shit. You weren't going to do it. You needed somebody to do it. And guess what? You picked the right guy. I know what the fuck to do here. And I know that I'm going to have to lie to you about it, but I'm still going to, I'm going to do what I need to do because I know what you're asking is the right thing to do. We need to end this shit. And for him, it was also a pride issue, right? Because the Dominion had taken over Cardassia. He was like, these motherfuckers, they're doing what? Being the prideful Cardassian that he is, he was like insulted by that. So he was like, if I have something to say about cleaning these fuckers out of my planet, I'm going to do that. And so but the balance that one has to strike when dealing with with knowing that the actions that one might take would have a net positive impact, but that you have to take some of your ethical standards or your morals. And that's something that we ask ourselves all the time, right? We have to, and it is very rare that you get to a point as it does in this particular episode where it is literally about life and death. But there are many instances in between that and, and something far less serious where we in government have to, are faced with similar decisions. And we just have to, and so the fact that the show actually helps us get there and takes one of the most like the character who's an absolute, gentleman, a a moral standard, who sets somebody who stood up to Picard. Remember that first episode of DS9 where he was just like looking at Picard, which many other folks would not have done in that position, even with the situation that occurred. Obviously, his wife had died at Wolf 359, so obviously he's thinking that this guy's the guy that's responsible. But not many people would have done that. And from the beginning, he was like this moral character who is like, I'm going to do the right thing, and I'm going to fight the right fight. And then he's put in that position, and he's like, what am I going to do here? And at the end, as he says, would I do it again? Yes, I would, but I'm not going to tell anybody about it. Erase this whole thing. So he needs to live with it, and he knows that part of his responsibility at that moment is living with that decision and living with the fact that there's a couple of people. There's a couple. In this case, we got there were Romulans in this case. Oh, and whatever race that blue-white dude that whatever race that was, whatever that guy was, but that alien,
the one-off rando alien,
exactly, the one-off rando alien. Like he knows that the life of that dude and of all the Romulans who were on that ship are on his. He is an accessory to murder, and he knows this, but he's like, but it had to be done. And now the Romulans are in the race in the war, and we might have a chance of winning this. So, fuck it, let's go.
I mean, I think something that the episode doesn't spell out, but that I really viewed clearly watching it, was that he as much as it's in the Federation's interest for the Romulans to join the war, it is also in the Romulans' interest to stop the Dominion. And I think that it becomes a little harder to swallow this story if we believe that Sisko is doing something that is amoral to the Romulans, when it's actually like, guys, with the argument Sisko presents them with earlier, like, they're going to go after you next, are you fucking crazy, is true. Like, it just is true.
Well, of course, but Elana, of course it is. But guess what? They're Romulans, not Vulcans. What you're saying is a logical conclusion to how these people operate. But guess what? Have you never heard of the Great Divide? Have you never heard of
no, it's true. Exactly. But I just mean, ethically speaking, it feels different to me. Like, I don't know. I don't know that I feel like in the story of the show, of course, Sisko did the right thing because that is how the show is structured. If this was the real life, I don't know what my ruling would be, but I do think that like it is a factor that ultimately the Romulans needed to join the fight for the Romulans' sake, not just for ours.
But it was ultimately it is obvious that certainly the Romulans were I think that probably certain folks over there thought, yes, we would be at risk, but we can probably handle these folks. The idea of having them like clean house with some of the enemies that we've had for literal generations, it's too sweet a thing to turn down. And they would figure we're going to deal with that later. It was absolutely necessary to present them with such a scenario for them to actually get involved, because they're ultimately self-serving. And the immediate self-serving is like, these guys are taking care of our enemies for us. God bless America. So they're going to let it happen. So the idea that this was what was necessary, they needed to believe that there was an actual threat against them that was direct and not just some logical conclusion to what the actions of the Dominion ultimately would be. Again, reunification hadn't happened yet. Elana, what's going on over there? Come on.
I think there's a lot of delusions of Romulan exceptionalism, right?
Yeah, it's making a really powerful point that I think is really analogous to what we experience in politics and activism a lot, which is you get into that sort of trying to make things line up perfectly with your ethical framework, and then the whole enterprise falls through. Like, you don't get anything done because you're hung up on making one or two sacrifices in order to make the thing work. I think that we've been seeing that a lot in national politics lately. And it's just fascinating to be looking at it through this thing where we are so on Sisko's side and on Garrick's side as well. And I love that you pointed out that he's got this sort of like immigrant tension where he's so protective of Cardassia, and at the same time so angry at the Cardassian government that like we really believe in them and believe that if they're doing this, it must be right. But Gustavo, I think you just sort of we bring these sort of questions back into our own lives and our own work. And we're kind of like, do I have the courage to make that sacrifice for the greater good? Or does it feel scarier and more complicated in real life than in a show where we're already rooting for the heroes?
And what is the greater good as well? Because, for example, earlier in one of the other episodes we were talking about earlier, when Bareil takes the fall for Opaka, right? He made the decision that the greater good, and by the way, I had forgotten about the Opaka twist. I had forgotten, which is a great name for a drink or something, the Opaka twist. But I had forgotten about that twist. But he made the decision. I will take the fall, and I will not. I will let this woman Kai win. But at that point, was she a Kai already? No, she was because that was the issue. She wasn't Kai yet.
No, she was a fellow Vedic or.
Right, she was Vedic.
Yeah,
Vedic when it went. So he will let this slimy person believe that she's got something on him enough to kill his career. But all he had to do was say the real thing that happened, which is that Opaka was the one that made the choice, not him. And he believes that for the greater good, he has to make that decision. Right. So this is a different decision for both of them for the common good. In the case of Sisko, it's like, I'm just going to stay quiet about this thing happening because ultimately we need the Romulans in this war to be able to even have a shot. And in the case of in that one, it was I am going to make a determination that it is better for people to hold Opaka in high regard as a symbol of purity. And what we should strive for, and not tell the truth, because that's better for everybody. And I'm going to let my career die, on the vine when go. And it would be better. And I think that we both agree that it would have been better. I mean, certainly people would have been heartbroken about Opaka, but Homegirl is dead. I mean, you had Bareil would have been able to serve as a much better Kai than Wynn was, because Wynn is a slimy person. Completely duplicitous asshole.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Bareil made the wrong choice, and that, like a lot of people, he has a bit of a martyr complex. I mean, watching this time, I feel like there is a real legitimate concern about what happens to the national mythology of the leader who saw folks through the revolution, if they view her as having been a conspirator. But there is a conversation you can have around that. And also, like, she sacrificed her own son. This wasn't somebody else's kids. This is like, I could say that she did the wrong thing, but it was clearly not motivated by self-interest. And the reality that we saw and that he knew was that if he didn't run, it'd be her. And it's interesting because it's so rare for any politician especially, to fall on their sword in a situation like this. And so it's kind of shocking to see him do that here. And also for me to then say that I think he was wrong to fall on his sword there. And I'm glad to see that you agree.
Yeah. And actually, I caught myself, quoting or paraphrasing The Undiscovered Country when I said human. I said that she was a human by making a mistake. That is in turn, that is a racist term. Remember in Undiscovered Country? When the Klingons say like humans, even the term is racist. So, but what I mean to say is an imperfect person, right? As opposed to as far as Opaka, like being viewed as an imperfect person, and just he was not willing to let that happen. I think it mixes with his martyr complex, but it's also this notion that we need this mythology about this person to be able to go forward, which I guess he made that decision. I mean, I don't think so. He says it. He says that it's the will of the prophets. So it is based on his faith. He's saying like, this is what the prophets have told me I need to do, because they were guilting the shit out of him when he was in the vision. So like he knew, it's like, all right, prophets, I will take this fall for this one. But
do you think anybody in real life would fall on their sword like that in politics? to hold it up national myth?
I don't know. I do not know. I'm sure I might have met some people in my career that might fall into that category, but I don't know. I mean, it would be hard to create a parallel of what exactly,
Yeah. I mean, because it's religious also. I mean, it's different,
I feel like in most cases, people who are as poorly suited for politics don't get as far as Bareil did, because one of the things that really emerges in that episode is that Bareil is very unskilled and uncomfortable in the political game. And while I think we acknowledge that, a lot of people would be a better Kai than Win, because Win is horrible.
yes.
But then at the same time, like, it raises the question to me, like, would Bareil actually have been a good Kai, or would he have been so limited by his unwillingness to play the political game and his lack of temperament for it that he would have created a different kind of problem?
That is, oh my God, that is some shit right there. that is some shit right there.
Good point.
Because you're right. It's not just the as Elana was saying earlier, the martyr complex, but I think you're probably right that he was just like, there's part of him which is like, shit, I can get out of this. I don't have to be in a situation where I'm going to have to make decisions for all these people and be looked at. Like, it does take a particular type of person to know the responsibility that entails to be a decision maker, particularly at the executive level. And so he was not ready for it. I think you're right to point that out. I think, didn't he, I have to, I guess, see, you people are going to make me rewatch this entire damn thing for the record. So, because I know that Bareil dies of like a disease or something. Not that, is it the same season or the next season?
It's like a season and a half later. And
Okay.
it is, what happens is they're in a terrible shuttle crash, and he gradually dies of his injuries because Wynn refuses to let him go into basically like a medically induced coma until Bashir can repair the damage. And he just kind of rolls over for her and says it's the will of the prophets. And that's how Bareil dies.
Because the thing is that there was like, she was asking for advice or something, right? There was some negotiation that he was in the middle of, and then she's like relying on him to be like, could you tell me what the fuck else? Like, who's this guy? Which is funny when you think about it. I guess he didn't have the capacity to be an executive, but he definitely had the capacity to be a diplomat. Like, he had the ability to do that. Because if I remember that correctly, that was the issue, that she was like, no, I need to talk to him. And she was like, yeah, keep me awake, because I got to tell her about this guy, and I got to tell her about this other guy, and the deals that we must have made or something. That was part of it. So he was set to be a diplomat.
But she's playing into his vanity because she's pretending that she needs his, like, I'm sure he's legitimately better at that than her, perhaps, but she totally is being like, oh, I need you, so that
she's a garbage, but she's a garbage human.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely. No, she doesn't give a shit if he dies. Like, she's a garbage human, but she does need him in that, it's like, I don't know what the hell I'm doing in this regard. Like, whatever, like, damn, we should have watched that episode, but it doesn't matter.
I think she did not need him and is just trying to get him to die. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's, and again, like, she sees that he has this martyr complex.
I got to watch that episode again, but I think knowing how much of a garbage human this person is, I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong, because Kai Wynn was terrible. Gotcha. Because I was going to ask you whether you think, I'm going to ask you all a question. Do you think, considering that we watched a couple of episodes with Wynn, and we watched a couple of episodes with Ducat, who's more of a garbage person, Ducat or Wynn? Because one of them is, they're both petty and small, but one of them is far more like cunning and certainly murderous. Like, Ducat is a murderous piece of garbage, but Wynn is like this small, like, she was willing to plunge her recently liberated planet into a goddamn civil war again over replicators because they weren't following what she wanted, right? So who's a worse alien, Ducat or Wynn?
I mean, I'm going to say Ducat because of also the level of the interpersonal violence from him, but I think ultimately she's all about power for herself directly, but there are moments where she does the right thing on rare occasion. And I don't actually think he has any. But Sarah, what do you think?
Yeah, I feel like it's hard to compare them. To me, if I were to choose, like, who is your favorite Deep Space Nine villain, I'm always going to sort of steer toward Wynn for the simple reason that, like, you don't meet many real life Ducats who like you they exist, you find them from time to time, but like the number of Kai Wins I have worked with in my lifetime, like she's such an everyday kind of horrible that like there's just something really appealing about one of the main antagonists being this passive aggressive jerk. That's just really like she's so relatable, and I think she's relatable to the point where like maybe I'm saying too much about myself, but like where you can kind of see yourself at your like I can't see myself at my worst moments becoming Ducat. I can see myself at my worst moments becoming Kai Wynn.
And you could see yourself at your worst moments, just seething, just saying kind of in a like, yes, of course, child. Every time she said that to Kira, I wanted to punch the damn screen. Of course, child. It's the way that she says it. Yeah, but I guess you are right. I have definitely met and have worked with some Kai Wins.
Yeah.
And so much of it really does go to Louise Fletcher too. And her, like you could see if you watch, I feel like we like now need to do the Kai Wynn episode where we kind of watch the progression.
We kind of had a bit of that when we had Anthony Oliveria on.
Like we talk about her a lot.
We do. Yeah. As I say, her exchange with Cisco in the beginning of that, the episode, where she's trying to get him to subtly support her campaign. That was what I was thinking of. That is the most passive aggressive thing that has ever been committed to camera, and it is brilliant.
And that is an absolute it's absolutely on the money. You just have to change a couple of the events or a couple of but that type of conversation, absolutely, I am aware of it happening all the damn time. Like this soft manipulation, kind of like, come on down with like, we'll do this thing. We'll like stand next to each other and talk about how great it is, and just for the sake of like, I just know that I need this person to stand next to me because it'll be beneficial to me politically. That absolutely felt like a real, like deeply political conversation in the way that, that sometimes, it's had in electoral politics. Like I could definitely see that.
And one of
Are there any other moments from these episodes?
One of the fun things is that you see over and over throughout the series, like Cisco is completely immune to Kai Wynn's way of moving through the world.
Yes.
And one of the things that both actors do really beautifully is like she'll go through her song and dance, and if you watch Avery Brooks, like you see the gears turning. It's like watch their conversations and watch whoever's not talking as much as the camera allows you to, because they're both very much stage actors, and they're doing like, you could see exactly what they're thinking of each other and how frustrated they are with each other whenever they interact. And it's just really fun. And really, I think a lot of what makes Wynn such a good villain is that you can see her reacting when what she's trying to do doesn't work.
Yeah, agreed. It's a great dance. And again, there's so many just fantastic performances throughout this whole thing. And I had forgotten. And it's, even though it's like, it's a slightly stunted type of acting that is of the time, right? There's a lot of things, as I said earlier, like the idea that in the first seasons, they were just completely enamored with this idea that there had to be a B story, right? So they would split between these two stories happening at the same time. And it's like, this is sitcom structure that gets tiresome. And eventually, I don't know when exactly they left it, but by the time you get to the episodes in the 5th or 6th season that I watched, like that's gone. And you're just telling one story. And I was like, yes, they kind of learned to get into that. And then this as well, even with the stunted sometimes acting, still, they're such great performances because they're great freaking actors. Like both, I was reminded of all these folks. It's such great stuff.
Are there other things from these episodes that you watched that you had a moment of being like, oh, that so happens in politics?
The
way that endorsement meeting went down.
It's like, I'll tell you, it's the thing is that certainly the duplicitous, slimy nature of Wynn, and what Sarah was saying, I will have to tip my hat to you, my friend, because you are correct. There is something that is, quotidian about her dickishness that makes her very relatable, as opposed to just this, this gargantuan, villainous, destructive force that Ducat was all the way to the end. But that Wynn was certainly a much more, recognizable one. So I think I was reminded in many of her interactions and in the way that she kind of goes through the world. The fact that there's this whole conversation that was it Bareil and Kira that have it when they're like telling themselves what the hell do people see in this woman? Like she's about to be elected Kai. Like what the fuck? Like how many times have I had that conversation about some people in politics right now? They don't know how much of a snake this person is. Are you kidding me right now? And yet they just go about the world and they keep acting as if though they're righteous, good people, and they're garbage humans. So I guess that certainly there were many instances, the instances that reminded me more of of some of the interactions that I've had in politics or I've seen in politics over the years. Basically every time Kai Wynn is on screen, there's something about the way that she's just, as you stated earlier, I think as Sarah said it, yes, there's something about the way that she moves around the world that just, it certainly reminds me of so much dickishness in the world that I inhabit.
Yeah. Yeah. Bajoran politics, as we see it, has factions that I think sometimes map to certain people are more religious traditionalists and others are either less religious or more progressive in their interpretations. Let me restate that. Bajoran politics, as we see it, has factions, which of course is always interesting when you're looking at a country that's just coming into independence after occupation. Some of these different factions relate to the particular religious interpretations of the religion that the people in that faction have, and others are more about what people's views of what the Bajoran relationship to the Federation should be. Different groups have different feelings about how to treat collaborators or, the people who worked with the Dominion, even if they told themselves they were, doing it to keep folks safe or what have you. Do you feel like the political divides we see on Bajor ring pretty true to the sorts of divisions you see in other nations or areas that are newly liberated in the real world?
I'd have to think about that a little bit, because I certainly think that and we talked about this a little bit earlier. It is fascinating to see a recently, liberated, for lack of a better term, right? The occupiers leave. They leave just the country bereft, in this case, a planet bereft of resources, with a barely functioning government, and then they have to rebuild, and they do so, but with faith at its core. Because I do think that there's something, and I'm sure that you've talked about this in prior episodes. Basically, they remind me of Jewish folks, as in there's some folks who see it as there's a deep religious strain to it, but other folks just see it as an identity. Mm-hmm. They might not participate in all the religious iconography or what have you, but they still deeply, deeply identify as that. So in the case of Bajorans, they see the prophets as a defining part of their identity, as as kind of the ones that have led them to this place and are kind of rebuilding around that. And so they look to the leaders who are the religious leaders as part of how they're going to do this rebuilding. And so that struggle that they have, and we've talked about it before, right? The idea that in the case of Kai Wynn, she is a religious leader who then becomes the leader of the actual civil government, and kind of does a terrible job of it, but gets to that position because of the way that she's respected as a faith leader. On Bajor, I don't necessarily see parallels outside of that, but I do think it's a fascinating notion of what happens when you have a country that is trying to get back on its feet, has a big part of its identity be defined by this. Because also we remember that the turning point, the series began with the discovery of the wormhole, right? Which is, there's like the Palace of the Prophets,
the Celestial Temple.
Thank you, the Celestial Temple. Right?
I feel like I'm wandering in with the facts.
Right. No, but you're absolutely wandering in at the right time, my friend. So yes, so the entire turning point of the entire story, right, is because there is the finding of the Celestial Temple. If the Celestial Temple hadn't been found, they would not have been able to, they wouldn't have been interested. They would have been interesting politically, maybe to the Federation. They would have taken that much longer to actually come in there. But everything kind of kicked into high gear, and it was their belief that the Celestial Temple and the emissary, right? Because there's also to understand that which is another thing that I find just fascinating about this series, that they make one of the main characters an important religious figure in the mythology of the planet that is there, right? So all of this means that faith is at the core of how they organize themselves politically. That faith is at the core of everything that they do, and as they try to rebuild themselves politically, faith is at the core of it. So what other parallels exist between countries that have been, that are post-occupation, that have faith at the center of it? I can't think of many. So that was a long way to go around the barn to say that I'm not necessarily sure that it reminds me of any one particular country.
Yeah, I think where it might be hard is that a lot of the examples that come to mind for us don't have a single unifying majority religion that has that kind of universal cultural sway that so many formerly colonized countries, either there's been a religion that's been forced upon them from the outside, or an effort to just completely squelch religious activity, or you're in a situation like India where you have a ton of religion.
Yeah.
Right.
So you're right. It's really hard to come up with an example that's as neat as Bajor.
When you have liberation, you then have partition, because of people being suppressed and then mushed into different areas, and there being heterogeneous religious populations that have been forced into conflict with each other. Yeah, no, it's interesting to hear the way that doesn't really correspond to things for us. I think that one parallel is, though, the question of independence versus joining in with more powerful alliances or political formations, etc., is about the main one I can find.
But again, what the Federation offers is not a normal kind of annexation scenario, right? It's not like you're going to become.
Well, depends who you ask.
Okay.
I think some people think that joining the Federation is going to do away with their culture. Certainly the Ferengi, their attitude is you're going to be sucked up into the root beerization, as I think Quark calls it at one point, it becomes like root beer. It's insipid. I think them people have a concern about human universal cultural hegemony or something like that. There's a piece to that.
And I can't disagree, except, when we're talking, the Ferengi is they're a completely different group of folk, right? They've, because at the center of their entire endeavor is, hyper capitalism, if you want to call it that, right? They have
Sure.
it's all about the rules of acquisition. This is at the centerpiece of their idea. That does not include collaborating with anybody. It does not, even business partners, as many of the rules of acquisition will tell you. And although I can't name them necessarily off the top of my head right now, I'm sure that many of the rules of acquisition will tell you that even partners can be lied to if you feel that there is profit to be gained from lying or betraying your partner. So the idea that they would actually annex to anybody is they would become part of the Federation is, I think, that's never going to happen because of the nature of what their culture actually is.
Yeah, and we see, and I think we on our list was an episode dealing with Ferengi politics, and there's several of them, but it's sort of talk about a culture that is a hyper-capitalist autocracy. And I think we can name a few real-world hyper-capitalist autocracies that have emerged in a much bigger way since Deep Space Nine has been made. And we actually had some thoughts about it. And one of the themes that we saw is that the Ferengi political episodes keep coming to the conclusion that power is actually a trap and something you don't want.
Well, it's certainly the one that I saw, and I'd have to see a couple of more of the ones that you're talking about, but the one that I saw, which was, it was also a little clumsy. It was the first episode. It was 11th episode of the first season, right? Season 1, episode 11. And they're still getting the hang of things, right? So it's like, it suffers a little bit from the stuntedness, if you will, of some of the first seasons, but it was still the idea. Yes. I mean, there was the Nagus fakes his own death, and then all of a sudden, after he names Quark as Nagus, and then the idea is that he's trying to protect his life and everybody's trying to kill him. But the Nagus comes back and takes that power very, very happily. Like, he knows how to manage that power. He just was like, he did it on purpose to kind of figure out, like, to flesh out whether his son was ready for the scepter, which he makes the conclusion that he's not. But he grabs that power very, very easily back then. He feels really comfortable with it. So maybe it's just that, even as greedy as Quark is, maybe Quark is not the one that's ready for that power. But the Nagus grabs it back very easily. And even in this very early episode, that guy also, God damn it, so many great performances. I love both Armin Shimmerman and the Nagus. I forget this
Wallace
guy's
Shawn.
name. Oh my God, so
Wallace
good.
Shawn. Yeah.
So good.
Noted socialist oh God, that's so bad. But noted socialist intellectual Wallace Shawn, in fact. He's written really good essays about why he's a socialist. And
going back, like he's been writing about being a socialist since like the 70s too. Like, this is
yeah.
What a great character that guy is.
How do you feel about Ferengi episodes? Because, like, I know that when we decided to watch this in preparation for this ship for us to tape, my partner was like, "Are you seriously going to make me watch a Ferengi episode with you?" And I'm like, "Yeah, that's what love means. It's watching Ferengi episodes with me." I take it you like Ferengi episodes.
It's just, I don't remember many of them. I know that there's probably like 10 or 15. I mean, they didn't make that many of them. I do appreciate the fact that they were made because if I remember correctly from Next Generation, they were kind of scarier, right? They were like scarier and more and darker, and they were made more, like, I don't know, more fun, if you will. And then Quark is such a great character, and the development of Rom as a responsible father, and the growing of Nog as his own individual. All of those. So you know what? Now that I'm thinking about it, because you said Ferengi episodes, and then I started mentioning all the characters and how they developed along, and I guess I do appreciate it. I do enjoy it because it developed that race as more complex than it was originally thought of, and they were like just great performances all around. And the development of those characters, Nog from being this annoying little rascal to to kind of like coming into his own, developing his own reputation, and the idea that he became the first Ferengi captain of an actual friggin' starship was just like that's an enormous thing. And the fact that Rom, who was obviously way smarter and more talented than Quark ever was just constantly. I mean, at first they didn't get him at first, right? They had to write him a little bit. Like in this episode, he's kind of shallow, but that's because it's the first episode, the first season. Everybody's shallow in the first season, but the notion that he was very, very purposely sacrificed to make sure that his son was in a better position than he was, and that he would do what he needed to do for his brother, because I guess he figured that his brother could be far more successful than him. So him being attached to his brother meant he would always have the resources to provide for his son. That's that's great character development. So I guess, yes, I like Ferengi episodes now that I think about them.
Well, my wife loves the Ferengi episodes, and whenever I start getting into it about the Ferengi, she's like, nope. Remember that you're thinking of the worst of them, but remember that there's like 5 or 6 that are among the best episodes of this entire series. And recalibrate your thinking. Think about little green men and not about like.
Oh my God, yes.
Yeah,
when they're shit. So I'd forgotten about that one. They're the aliens in Roswell. I forgot.
Yeah, that the problem is that the bad ones are real bad, and they make you forget that the good ones are real good.
I got to rewatch this whole freaking show. You people are gonna make me rewatch this whole damn show.
Yeah, that's what we do.
Yeah.
It is.
So we want on just sort of a different note than where we've been going for the rest of it, but one of the things that we've gone into over and over in a lot of different ways is that Deep Space Nine, in a lot of ways, represented diversity well, especially for its time. But one of the big gaps was that it had very little Latina representation. It had that one character, Kike, who showed up for about 3 episodes and promptly died in order to, spur O'Brien to fight in war. But sort of how do you respond to that lack of representation as a viewer, and where do you see yourself reflected?
Well, I didn't. It is in hindsight that I think about such things, because I'll tell you, it was certainly when I was watching it when it was fresh, right, in my memory, or when it was brand new, right. It is not something that I really thought about. So I grew up in Puerto Rico, right? So I didn't grow up in the U.S. I grew up in Puerto Rico, and my English comes from watching cable television. So it wasn't. So I didn't have such thoughts about inclusion or lack of representation. It just wasn't something I thought about when I first watched it. And it's only in hindsight that I kind of think about that, and I think about the fact that I learned the English I learned was from watching things like The Facts of Life or Cheers, or Friends, like every single one of them, just like the supremely white shows. And part of that is added to the mix that, I'm light skinned and certainly white passing. When I got off the plane in 1998 from Puerto Rico, I thought I was white. And it wasn't until, finding myself face to face with the fact that, there's a couple of experiences that I had in my first couple of years here. But I remember, I think it was the first semester or the second semester of grad school when there was like this mixer for new students or something. And I go, and one of the professors, and I've since forgotten who this person was, but I think it was I'm pretty sure it was a white lady, who was like, she introduced myself, she introduced herself. And then, I said, what my name was, and I said from where I was. And she, in all seriousness, said, "Oh, you're from Puerto Rico. Oh, you must be one of the good ones." Like, she actually said this aloud. And it was, and I was like, I don't, what? I don't understand. It was such a confusing moment, because I was, what is that? What does that mean? It took me a little bit, like my political education really didn't start until I started teaching college. And I started teaching college in 1999. I got to New York in 98. I started teaching college at Hunter College in 1999. I was 23 at the time. and I was having, and then I started to kind of really come to grips with the fact that there is, what my privilege is, or my privilege has continued to be. I mean, I'm a white passing, straight, cis, tall, bilingual, educated male. Like there was so much that I kind of started to realize about what my own experience was by talking to the students that were in my classroom, who were from every, it's Hunter College, so it was every ethnicity you could think of, and meeting them and finding out that there are people in my classroom who were probably smarter and harder working than I was, but they didn't have the access that I did, or the privilege that I did. And so all of that to say that when I was watching this originally, it never entered my mind as far as like representation or lack thereof. Since then, I would say that certainly and actually came, even though it was certainly not as good a show as we would have all liked, but when Elana Torres was introduced in Voyager, and I'm like, oh shit, her last name is Torres. Like that's, and she definitely looks either Puerto Rican or Dominican. Like the fact that she was half Dominican, half Klingon. What a goddamn mix that is. Woo! That's like she was another just spectacular. I think I will tell you this is a little secret. I do think that my particular attraction for strong women came from watching Star Trek. so there's that. But as far as representation, I never really thought about it. And it wasn't until, now I'm looking back on it, and there's still, I mean, it would have been probably, I think it probably would have been better. But then since most of these folks certainly most of the actors were white, but, a Ferengi's not white, a Klingon is not white. Certainly many of the Klingon actors are black, actually. So there's so many of these folks that are not, that weren't necessarily human. So I guess it didn't come into my mind as much.
I think what you're saying that's really interesting is that it's like it doesn't come into your mind until you get the positive, visible representation that you're saying, that moment of seeing Elana Torres, who's played by Roxanne Dawson, whose birth name is Caballero. I was trying to quickly look up what her exact background is, but she's definitely a Latina actress playing a character who is of mixed Latina and Klingon descent. But yeah, that when you get that positive representation, it occurs to you, but when it's absent, you don't always see it. Yeah. Especially, I think, in the 90s when, as you said, we were so used to seeing shows that were just flat out all white casts.
Yeah. There also might be a piece of this too, though, where I did not visit Puerto Rico in the 90s or 80s, Lord knows. So I don't know what most TV was, but I know for a lot of people in other countries, they're like, well, most of the shows that we have that are local do have people who look like me on them. So when I'm looking at shows from the US, I'm not looking to see myself because I see myself on our local shows.
That's actually quite interesting.
I don't know if that was a factor.
That's probably true, because the thing is, I loved cable television, right? But we still had our local channels, and I still watched, there were 4 or 5 shows that I watched religiously every week. Certainly I watched the news all the time. My mom was consistently watching soap operas although most soap operas were not Puerto Rican, they were Mexican. Most of them were Mexican.
Yeah.
And
most of them were as pale as me, and I basically have no melanin on me. But
exactly. But yes, there's also the fact that there is. I mean, Puerto Rico is also. It is kind of it is also a racist society. There is a colorism in Puerto Rico, which is like we're talking about Mexico. Like most people in Mexican TV are not indigenous. They are, they're light-skinned, white-passing people, and they're very European looking, certainly. And that kind of that probably was very true of people of most TV in Puerto Rico as well. There were some characters in some comedy shows, etc., where there was some comedic actors that certainly were, obviously black. But for the most part, it just wasn't part of the discourse that I was thinking about as far as representation in media or in public. It was not something I thought about.
I think our question that we have to wrap is, are there examples or ideas from the Star Trek world that you feel like are lessons that people can learn in their activism and organizing work?
Let me think about that one. I mean, I'd have to, I mean, I would say that having, you know, as we talked about before, the fact that Trek up until this moment, up until DS9, and certainly at the beginning of DS9, there was still kind of this a veneer of just the veneer of utopia, and then it was kind of muddied by being in contact with, you know, recently occupied territories and, you know, and war and all that sort of stuff. That, you know, that there is something to be said about striving for things that are better. There is something to be said for striving for not having to use currency, you know, having guaranteed healthcare for everybody, having a replicator in every corner so nobody's ever hungry. Like those things are, I think those things are worth striving for. I'm not sure we'll ever achieve it, but they're certainly worth striving for. And I guess just that the as I look back at some of these episodes that I watched for this process, and thinking specifically, since there was so much there was so much about Bajor in there, the development of Bajor as a struggling democracy, just that there is in the same vein that there's something. It is worth fighting for a system that is representative and a system that gives everybody shared prosperity. That maybe fighting for certainly fighting for a replicator in every corner might be too far afield. But fighting to make sure that we got replicators for everybody, or not replicators, but reclamators for more people might be a worthwhile endeavor. So I would say that's kind of what comes to mind.
I feel like for me, a lot of it from this show in particular is about coalition building and what that looks like.
I like that.
Yeah.
But yeah. So is there anything we haven't hit up yet that you would like to talk about vis-a-vis Deep Space Nine?
Just like, I mean, I'll tell you that is, I repeat again that it is my absolute favorite Trek show. And, you know, not to crap on the newbies, but just, you know, I saw I saw a season and a half of Discovery, and I'm like, I can't do it. It's like, I have to just acknowledge this if I start from scratch. A friend of mine who's a big Trek fan told me, you just have to think about it as a show that happens in a different universe. Like, just think about it in a different universe and maybe it'll be better. I am very appreciative that y'all helped me to kind of, you know, revisit and rediscover the show, because there's so much about it that I appreciate. There's the portrayal of the imperfect nature of politics and the imperfect nature of relationships. And, you know, and I'm sure that you've had conversations about, you know, about identity and sexuality, and like the idea of trills, I just find amazing, just fascinating. And it was those shows were so well done, talking about identity and the fact that he was called Old Man. I love that right from the beginning. They were talking about a trans character right in your face, and you kind of like dealt with it. And the fact that there were so many strong women in the show, there's and that as they got comfortable with the writers got more comfortable, then they started to kind of develop their own style and just develop characters that were shallow at the beginning. There's something about the show that I really, really, really love. And again, even the quaint, silly, slow ass fight scenes just, you know, brought me back to when I watched them, you know, when they were first airing. So I'm appreciative for the opportunity to be able to revisit some of these shows, and I'll say it for one last time, I think you freaking people are going to make me rewatch the whole damn show.
Please do, and let us
Woohoo!
know what you think and what other insights you have, because it has been an absolute pleasure and delight just hearing your thoughts and hearing your perspective on this show that we love.
I appreciate you giving me the
Yeah.
invitation. I was really looking forward to this.
Oh, I'll let you close us out with one thing. It can take us a hot minute to finish editing these episodes, but sadly, we know that the crisis on Puerto Rico is going to be ongoing.
Yeah.
If you have thoughts about good places for folks to donate money,
Yes.
let me know.
I do. Back 5 years ago, Maria struck Puerto Rico. And one of the things that became very clear to me as I was trying to help out folks back there was that the best way to do so was to identify organizations on the ground that were already in existence before the crisis, before the hurricane. Organizations that are Puerto Rican led, that have connections and credibility all over, in the community that they are in, and that already know how to serve the communities that they are in, and they just need more resources to do it. And so I partnered up with an organization called the Maria Fund back then that operated on that notion, that the goal of finding, of an organization that's founded in New York was not to rewrite the book on things. It was to find the organizations that were already doing work and then give them more resources so they can do more of it. So these same folks that started the Maria Fund back in 5 years ago started the Fiona Community Response Fund. And the way that you find, if you go to Fiona, if you search Fiona Community Response Fund, it'll direct you to a website where you can see the organizations that are being supported. These are Ayuda Legal, Taller Salud, Agitarte, Étnica, Instituto para la Agroecología, Campamento contra las Cenizas de Peñuelas, and Hacer. All of those are organizations that are Puerto Rican led, Puerto Rican based. They're already doing organizing on the ground way before the storm, and giving them resources so that they can not only aid in the immediate aftermath of this particular storm, but to continue to build power in the communities that they're based in is the best way to actually help Puerto Rico get on its feet in a real way. So one last time, if you Google Fiona Community Response Fund, you'll be able to find these folks, and every single dollar that you go that goes to them will go to one of these organizations that is doing work on the ground.
Thank you. I'm giving it to them now, and I'll include a link to it in our podcast notes. I found it right away.
Thank you.
So, so where can our listeners keep up with your I usually see your work online, but that's different. Keep up with you on the internet.
Well, you certainly. I believe that you are familiar with my Twitter presence. At NY Senator Rivera is the best way to do it. It is actually me writing these damn tweets. 95% of them, as you will notice if you pay attention for even a little bit.
Yes,
it's kind of They kind of has my own personality in it. But at NY Senator Rivera is me on Instagram. You can find me on Facebook, etc. And if you are a Bronxite and you live in the Northwest Bronx, particularly in the new parts of my district in Riverdale, just look me up, Gustavo Rivera, and then you will find a way to contact my Senate office. And we got a lot of good work to do next year, but I'm hoping that we got some good legislative successes. I'm working on some stuff already.
I love it. And it's so funny. I was just realizing, we've spoken so much about Puerto Rico and nothing at all about the Bronx. So I apologize in advance for that. But I have Puerto Rico on the brain right now for a lot of reasons, So, yeah.
Yes, I understand and I appreciate it.
But obviously we appreciate your service in the New York community as well. So as for me, I am online a little bit too much on Twitter at ELANA_Brooklyn. That's ELANA_Brooklyn. And of course, this podcast is part of Graphic Policy Radio, where comics and politics meet. And Sarah, where can our listeners find you?
I am on Twitter a lot less than Elana thinks I should be, at Padishat, PAS_DECHAT. Although I will warn you that the figure skating season has started. So if I'm back on Twitter, it's going to be like 5 a.m. play-by-plays of like ice dance in Germany. I am also PAS_DECHAT on Letterboxd, where I am actually remembering to put up my film reviews again. And I write about film and figure skating at thefinersports.com.
Excellent. I have well, you know what? I'll share. I have a big piece on Judas Priest coming out, but I'll share that information when it's there. But I guess that's what we have to say. And Sarah, does Odo have any final words for us today?
Yes. Thank you for listening to Deep Space Dive. And as Odo says, if you're out of reclamators, don't be Kai Wynn about it.
Ooh.
I love it.
Hey, thanks for watching the previous video from Graphic Policy Television. Just by watching, you help support our site. Thank you so much. Now, if you're watching these videos, you probably care about geeky things like movies, television, comic books, toys, games, video games, you name it. You can go and subscribe right now to our YouTube channel to stay in touch and catch all the new videos, or check out our website at graphicpolicy.com. There's a nice link on this end of the video. But as always, thank you for watching. Keep on rocking and keep it geeky.